When we think of weapons, we imagine missiles, fighter jets, or nuclear bombs. But what if I told you that the most powerful weapon America ever created doesn't fire bullets, doesn't drop bombs, and doesn't leave a trail of smoke in the sky? Instead, it lives quietly in contracts, numbers, and promises, invisible to most people. That weapon is debt. With debt, the United States has reshaped the global economy, built an empire without colonies, and kept rivals on a financial leash they can never break. No explosions, no invasions, just numbers on paper, numbers strong enough to decide wars, topple governments, and dictate the future of entire nations. And the most chilling part? You, me, and billions of others are also caught in this web, often without even realizing it. To understand how America quietly turned debt into its greatest weapon, we have to go back to the end of World War II. Picture the world in 1945. Europe was a smoking ruin, Japan's cities were flattened, and even the once mighty British Empire was drowning in bills it could never repay. But across the ocean, America stood tall. Its factories were untouched by war. Its gold reserves were overflowing. Its industries were producing at full throttle. The U.S. wasn't just a victor. It was the only superpower with money to spend. And here's where the story takes a sharp turn. Instead of ruling the world by force, America realized it could rule by finance. It could use loans, bonds, and credit the way past empires had used swords and cannons. Nations desperate to rebuild their economies would line up to borrow from Washington and Wall Street. And every dollar borrowed came with invisible strings attached. The genius of this strategy was subtlety. Unlike armies, debt didn't need to be fed, trained, or deployed. It didn't scare people into obedience overnight. Instead, it wrapped slowly around nations, like a chain of promises that grew heavier every year. The more countries borrowed, the more influence America gained. What started as help would quietly transform into control. And as we'll see, the U.S. discovered that debt could be used not just to rebuild, but to reshape the entire world order in its image. The story begins with something that looked like generosity: the Marshall Plan. After World War II, Europe was starving. Cities were destroyed, industries were frozen, and millions faced poverty. America stepped in with a grand offer, billions of dollars in aid to rebuild. But this aid wasn't a free gift. Much of it came in the form of loans, contracts, and financial obligations that tied Europe's future to America's economy. On the surface, it was rescue. Beneath the surface, it was leverage. European nations that accepted the plan not only rebuilt faster, but also became dependent on American financial support. And with dependency came influence. America didn't need to occupy Paris, Rome, or Berlin with troops. Debt and dollars did the work of armies. But there was a bigger move coming. In 1944, even before the war ended, the U.S. led a meeting at a place called Bretton Woods. Here, they created the rules for the new global financial system. And the centerpiece of that system was simple. The U.S. dollar would become the world's reserve currency, backed by gold. This meant that if countries wanted to trade, if they wanted to buy oil, if they wanted stability, they had to hold U.S. dollars. And to get those dollars, many had to borrow them from American banks, American institutions, or from organizations America controlled. Suddenly, the world wasn't just rebuilding with American money. It was running on American money. Fast forward to the 1970s. The dollar had been under pressure. In 1971, President Nixon made a shocking move. He cut the dollar's link to gold. Overnight, the U.S. dollar became what economists call a fiat currency, backed not by gold, but only by trust. Most countries would have collapsed after such a move. But America had a backup plan. It struck a secret deal with Saudi Arabia and other oil-rich nations. The deal was simple. Oil would only be sold in U.S. dollars. Every nation, from Germany to Japan to Brazil, needed oil. And to get oil, they needed dollars. This became known as the petrodollar system. It created endless demand for U.S. currency, and it gave Washington an unmatched weapon. If a country stepped out of line, America didn't need to invade. It could cut them off from dollars, and by extension, from the oil and trade their economies depended on. But perhaps the sharpest edge of America's debt weapon came through two institutions: the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. Officially, these were global organizations created to help developing countries grow. In reality, they often became debt machines. Here's how it worked. A poor country facing crisis would go to the IMF for help. The IMF would loan money, but with strict conditions. Reform your economy. Cut social spending. Privatize industries. Open your markets. On paper, these were reforms. In practice, they made poor countries dependent on foreign corporations and forever trapped in cycles of debt. Many nations in Africa, Latin America, and Asia found themselves unable to escape. Every loan led to another loan. And at the center of this system was always the U.S., the largest shareholder, the loudest voice, the one country with veto power. By the late 20th century, America had built something no empire before it ever achieved: an empire of financial chains. Not colonies, not armies spread across the globe, but nations tied down by invisible bonds of debt. As the Cold War heated up, America's debt weapon proved more powerful than nuclear missiles. While the Soviet Union drained itself in a costly arms race, the U.S. financed its military buildup through bonds and credit, selling debt to its own allies. Washington didn't just borrow. It convinced the world to fund its borrowing. Japan, Germany, and later China bought U.S. debt in staggering amounts because they needed dollars to trade and survive in the dollar-dominated system. Think about that. America could fight wars in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, not because it always had the money, but because the rest of the world kept lending it. No other empire in history ever pulled off such a trick. Rome taxed its provinces. Britain drained colonies. But America made the world willingly finance its empire. In the modern era, the debt weapon has evolved into something even sharper: financial sanctions. When countries like Iran, North Korea, or Russia challenge American dominance, Washington doesn't always send in troops. Instead, it cuts them off from the dollar-based financial system. Banks freeze. Trade stops. Economies collapse. And all of this can happen without a single missile being launched. It's financial warfare. Invisible to the average person, but devastating to entire nations. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 showed this power. Overnight, Russian banks were locked out of the SWIFT system. Billions in reserves were frozen. The ruble almost collapsed. It was a reminder that the real battlefield isn't always on land, sea, or air. Sometimes, it's inside spreadsheets and bank ledgers. But here's the hidden cost. Debt as a weapon doesn't just affect governments. It also trickles down to ordinary people, you and me. Inflation, rising interest rates, and exploding national debts translate into higher living costs, stagnant wages, and shrinking savings. When America borrows trillions to fund wars or bailouts, it looks like free money. But the bill always comes later, in the form of diluted dollars, more taxes, and weaker purchasing power. The same pattern Rome followed with its debased coins, or Germany with its hyperinflated marks, is happening in slow motion across the modern world. And now, the cracks are showing. Countries like China, Russia, and even U.S. allies are searching for ways to escape the dollar trap. They trade in local currencies, stockpile gold, and create alternative systems like BRICS banking networks. They know that as long as they depend on the dollar, they're vulnerable. But here's the paradox. Escaping the dollar system isn't easy. The chains of debt are deep. The global economy still runs on green paper with Washington's seal. And for now, America's quiet weapon continues to dominate the battlefield of nations. Here's the truth. America didn't turn debt into a weapon by accident. It was deliberate, step by step, policy by policy. First the Marshall Plan, then Bretton Woods, then the petrodollar, then the IMF, and finally the sanctions system. Each layer made the world more dependent on U.S. money, and each layer gave Washington more power. This isn't just economics. It's geopolitics, it's strategy, and it's the reason why the United States could fight trillion-dollar wars, bail out banks during crises, and still convince the world to lend it more money. But history gives us warnings. Rome thought it could cheat its citizens by minting weaker coins. Germany thought it could print its way out of debt in the 1920s. Zimbabwe thought the printing press could create prosperity. In every case, the people paid the price. Wealth evaporated. Trust collapsed. Empires fell. America's debt weapon may look unstoppable, but no empire escapes the laws of money forever. When a currency loses trust, collapse comes. Slowly, then suddenly. The same dollar that today commands obedience could one day trigger chaos if confidence breaks. And if the world stops believing in the dollar, America's greatest weapon could instantly become its greatest weakness. America's genius was turning debt into a weapon so quiet, most people didn't even notice. But history tells us no weapon works forever. Rome's coins became worthless. Germany's marks became wallpaper. Zimbabwe's dollars became trash. And one day, the same could happen to the U.S. dollar. When that day comes, the world won't just face a financial crisis. It will face the collapse of the very system that has ruled it for almost a century. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And if we ignore the rhyme, the cost will be paid. Not by governments, not by elites, but by ordinary people like you and me. So the question is, when the weapon of debt finally backfires, will we be ready? If you found this eye-opening, subscribe for more untold financial history. Because history doesn't just explain the past, it warns us about the future.